Hello, and welcome to another episode of F Stopping by the Woods. In this episode, Sumit and I are going to talk about something which everyone who's been a wildlife traveler has thought about at some point in their wildlife journey, which is about the steep costs involved with wildlife travel. And we're going to talk about what makes it so expensive, how some of these experiences are different in India versus countries outside, and what might be contributing to some of these costs, and maybe how we should think about our own wildlife travel differently. Both Sumit and I have grown up in India. We fell in love with wildlife here. We picked up our cameras here. A large part of our wildlife photography journeys began in India. In the early 2010s, we thought of Africa as something that we'll do once or very occasionally. But as we did it the first time and saw the kind of value it gave for the kind of money we spent, it's something we've started doing more and more frequently. And this is what that conversation's about, which is in terms of where we get the best return for the kind of money we spend on wildlife travel. And just to be clear, while parts of this might sound like a rant, that isn't the objective. We have friends in organizations that are responsible for tourism. We have friends in the forest department here, and we have deep respect for the work they do. This conversation isn't directed against any organization or sort of individual. It's simply about two travelers talking about the steep costs involved in wildlife photography and how we might need to think about it a little differently uh, given the steep costs, and how somebody else who's in a similar or a slightly earlier stage in their wildlife travel and wildlife photography journeys could think about it. So, Sumit, welcome to this episode. Thank you for making time for this. And let's start with maybe the elephant in the room, which is the expenses involved with wildlife photography. Why is it so costly? What are the elements adding to that cost?
Well, I mean, we know this, right? The very fact that somebody can travel itself is a marker of privilege. I mean, what percentage of our country can think about a few weeks of vacation each year? So let's get that right out of the way. But then wildlife photography and wildlife travel is yet another level of privilege because there's, in the case of photography, the cost of camera gear. But even in the case of just general wildlife travel all across the world, access is costly, right? And whether it is access by, paying a permit fee or whether it is access by booking yourself into an expensive lodge, that access itself can tend to cost a pretty penny. And so, yeah, I mean, those things add up, right? And so we're speaking from a position of privilege, and I think we should recognize that.
Yes, absolutely. The fact that we are having this conversation, the fact that we've been doing this for close to 18, 20 years right now, the fact that we have traveled outside India for wildlife photography, and the fact that we've been to some of uh, the most beautiful wildlife destinations, India and abroad, means that we sort of acknowledge our privilege. We sort of accept the fact that there are these very, very few people in the world who can do this, and we are thankful for having had those experiences, right? So let's sort of break down the cost because, again, in the blog that you wrote recently, it speaks of wildlife experiences in India versus, say, wildlife experiences in Africa. You've broken down the cost of a week of travel to, I think you'd compared Kruger, you'd compared Tadoba, and you'd compared Yellowstone. And you said how the cost of each of these places, if you're Indian, are pretty much sort of the same. So could you break that figure down to us and give everyone like an understanding of what the ballpark costs involved are?
Yeah, but first let's try to understand the categorization of the costs, right? So there is the cost which gets you entrance into a wildlife area. So call that
Yeah.
permit cost, vehicle cost. Then, even if you are not going for luxury stays, there's going to be some sort of cost of stay. If
Yes.
you're a photographer, then maybe the wilderness charges you some sort of a cost for your camera gear. Then if somebody is facilitating sightings for you, whether that's a guide, whether that's a lodge, then there are costs related to that. And then there are other incidental costs that get tacked on, right? So there might be food, there might be local transportation and whatnot. So if you then start to look at all of these costs put together, then you can visit Kruger on a self-drive safari and
Yeah.
spend about $1,500 or thereabouts there. And if you had to visit, let's say, our best and arguably our best tiger reserve, just because of the number of tigers that it has, Tadoba, that's about 1400 $1,300 to $1,400 at minimum. And at the most, it can go all the way up to $4,000, which might actually be a fair comparison with Tadoba for the simple reason that you're comparing full days to full days. Because remember,
Yeah.
in India, access is timed. So when I say $1,400 in Tadoba, I mean 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. But when I say $1,500 in Kruger, I mean be out there for the whole day for as long as you please, right? So if you had to compare apples to apples, then a similar experience in Tadoba gets you to about $4,000, which is quite a lot, a few multiples. And then there is something like the world famous Yellowstone National Park, where there are grizzlies, wolves, coyotes, whatnot, right? And that costs in an expensive country, in probably one of the most expensive countries out there, just about $1,100. And one of the reasons for that
Yeah.
is that the cost of access in Kruger and in Yellowstone is very, very low as compared to the cost of access in parks like, Tadoba, Ranthambore, those kinds of places, right? For reference, and not to make too fine a point of this, you get access to to pretty much all the South African national parks for $374, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and you get access to all American national parks for an entire year for $80. $80,
Yes.
right? And that makes a huge difference. On the other hand, if you consider, access for one drive in the core zone of Tadoba, that can be up to $300 for one 3 hour drive.
Yeah. We will talk a little bit about the specific services that we get in a bit, but these are sort of steep costs, aren't they? I mean, these are really, really expensive costs. And going back to the earlier point you made in terms of 6 hours in a jungle versus an entire day in the jungle, we need to also sort of acknowledge the fact that we might not be able to do an apples to apples comparison here at all simply because of the rules. And Tadoma might be one of those few places in India where you can actually evaluate what a full day safari costs and compare it to Kruger, because there's very few parks in India. I think Central India is the only place which allows these safaris which are all day, because in most Indian parks access is restricted to 3 hours in the morning and maybe 4 hours in the afternoon, and you can't be in sort of the park the entire day even if you wanted to sort of pay for it. As far as a lot of the Indian parks are concerned, the general the general layout seems to be that you stay outside in a park area, and most of your variability in costs comes in terms of the things you do outside the park. Okay, which is like which kind of hotel you stay in, what kind of food you get there, and what kind of frills you have around that. Whereas the wildlife related things are mostly a single menu experience given to everybody. There is nothing much to choose from. For example, you couldn't really spend more money and stay for more hours in the jungle, or you couldn't choose for a different kind of experience in the forest. You couldn't choose for example, a walk in some part of the forest if you wanted to, because this is a single set sort of menu experience that is given to people. You can't camp inside. You don't have too many places in the jungle where you can get down and spend some time, etc. You are expected to be in this, and all of this have a lot of safety, regulatory, and crowd control reasons associated with them, and all of them might be very good reasons, but just calling that out as well. in a lot of countries, you're allowed to set foot in the park, you're allowed to stay inside, you're allowed to set up camp there. In India, most of your travel to wildlife destinations will involve you staying outside a protected area, very close to wildlife. You still might get to see a lot of things in the places you're staying in, but once you enter the gates of a park, your experience is pretty much what the authorities offer you, with not much to choose for and not too much of a variation in menu. So that being said, what are some of the things that make Africa provide a better experience for wildlife visitors? Let's start with maybe the rules and the implementation overall. How do you think that differs to what we have in India versus what we get in Africa?
Yeah. So, look, one of the things I've been, and you spoke about this in the last discussion that we had, right? You can't have your sixth beer first. So, as you do more wildlife travel, your tastes change. And now, if I look at where I am at, I'm less about collecting photographs and more about collecting experiences. So, I want a bit of a holistic experience when I visit a wildlife area. And so, many of the things that I didn't consider important earlier are now important to me. For example, being able to navigate myself in a wilderness area, right? Find my own game.
Yeah.
Which probably means that because I don't have that much experience with that wilderness area, my chances of sightings are going to be a little low, but I'm also
Yeah.
cultivating my own skills in the process.
Yeah.
Then, being able to get down somewhere in the wilderness, you know, take in the moment, slow down, all of that kind of stuff, right? So the good old picnic.
Yes.
So being able to do something like that, being able to stay inside the wilderness is important, right? Uh, being able to chart my own course without being heckled, without wondering, oh, am I on the right route? Am I not on the right route? Once I'm in the forest, once I'm in the wilderness, I'm in the wilderness. I go wherever I want,
Yes.
right? So those
You
little
provided
things,
that, I mean, sorry, the caveat being that you stick to routes and you stick to
correct,
paths that you're allowed to be on and so on and so forth. Exactly. We're
correct.
not
And
talking really about off-roading here. We're just
I'm
talking
not
about
talking about
routes
off-roading.
that,
I'm talking,
exactly.
yeah, exactly. Some broadly laid out rules, like stay within this speed limit, do not get out here, but you can get out here. These are the tracks that are earmarked for tourism. These are the tracks that are not earmarked for tourism, so on and so forth, right? But within those bounds, I do what I want without being heckled at every juncture, right? So that's what I'm looking for, a slightly more holistic experience, which makes it a good departure from work because, frankly, I'm just an average dude who gets about 4 weeks of holiday. And I want to have a good holiday in the presence of interesting wildlife, right? I understand why in a park that has dangerous predators, you should not be getting down at random places. There are designated places to get down. But
Yes.
once you get down, can you have a good time there? And good time doesn't mean I'm going to be turning on my music and you know doing a disco there. It just means that can I go out, can I stretch, can I actually have fun with my family, do photographs, whatever, right? So, and are there enough of these places? For example, even a little thing, we don't think of this enough, but it affects the number of women that are wildlife travelers. Actually, are there enough restrooms in the wilderness area, right? Or are you expecting women to just squat behind a
Yeah.
bush? So these little things matter when it comes to providing people a good holistic travel experience in any wilderness area.
Yes. Absolutely. Really important point about uh, restrooms, because somehow we tend to pick up the places we go to when we're traveling with family. And that is a huge sort of uh, decision criteria. And by not having those, you're just cutting away access to women from a large number of the otherwise really beautiful places that they might have wanted to see, right? And I can almost hear a very easy counter, which is that, oh, well, if you start letting people have a picnic in Tadoba, they're going to litter, they're going to be noisy, so on and so forth, right? And therefore, we're not going to have anyone get out anywhere. Which reminds me a little bit like the other rule that's there in Tadoba that you've spoken about, which is that mobile phones aren't allowed in Safari. You're not even allowed to carry it. I'm told that you need to lock them away in a box somewhere, and after your sort of game drive is done, you pick it up. And from what I understand, the genesis of this rule is that somebody was trying to take a selfie with a tiger in the photo. They fell down. I don't know if it led to any injuries or whatever, but after that incident, mobile phones are not allowed in the park, which also cuts off access to a lot of people to capture a memory that they would have otherwise liked to capture, tiger or no tiger. The fact that they're in a game drive for which they've paid so much money, people would like to keep memories of that. And the rules that we have in some of the parks seems to follow this principle, which is that let's do what is most easily implementable in order to prevent a certain sort of scenario happening. Well, people are going to litter if you allow them picnic, so nobody can get down anywhere in a park. If somebody were to do something crazy and they were trying to take a selfie or whatever, they're going to likely to fall and create an incident. So let's not allow phones at all. You see, it seems to be based on what is most easily implementable, as opposed to what makes for a good experience for the person who is paying the fees that they are to enter the forest, right? And that for me is a little bit of the fundamental difference here in terms of the rules and its implementation. You also speak a lot about zones and access, right? Like, for example, a lot of Indian parks have permits by a particular zone in a jungle. And that can really impact the wildlife viewing experience we have, which is not the case with any of the other jungles you've seen abroad. Uh, Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, before that, just a little bit about the point that you were trying to make, right? About what's the most easily implementable. And in India, unfortunately, we seem to think that bans are the most easy to implement kind of thing, right? So somebody did something stupid with a mobile phone, therefore, mobile phones are bad, and hence ban the mobile phone in the park, right? And the way I'd like to characterize this is that we make rules for idiots and not rules for everyone else, right? So, for
Yeah,
example, there's an idiot who litters food. And what if that food was meat and they littered bones? Then now you're leaving food for wild animals. So don't allow meat,
yeah,
right? There is some idiot who decided to overspeed inside a park, cause some distress to animals as a consequence. So now reduce the speed all the way to 20, which is silly, right? I mean,
yeah,
in Kruger, on the paved roads, you can go at 50 kilometers an hour. On the gravel roads, you can go at 40 kilometers an hour. And that's a reasonable speed, right? Because you can be in control, you can brake if you need to, and your vehicle doesn't veer off course.
yeah,
20 kilometers an hour, you barely cover ground, right? Especially in the big zones that we have inside our national parks. But the
yeah,
problem is that we create rules for the lowest common denominator, the idiots, as against saying that let's single them out. Let's find some way of being able to name, shame, punish, fine,
yeah,
whatever those individuals, rather than reducing the quality of the experience for everyone. And the mobile phone thing is, in my opinion, a really exclusionary kind of rule. And I think
yes,
I want to make a point about that. You and I have good cameras, but the
yeah,
average family doesn't carry an extra camera with them, right? For them, the phone is a way of making a memory of that family holiday. And when you take that
absolutely.
away, then you spawn an entire industry which exists now in Tadoba, which sits outside the gate and rents out cameras to people. That's an additional cost, by the way,
Yes,
for what is an already costly vacation.
yes,
So these are things that really sour the overall experience. And remember, for us, it's photographs, but for most people, it's also a holistic experience, a holiday
yeah.
that you're trying to have a good time in, right? So that's the point. Sorry, I forgot the original question that you asked me, and I went on this little rabbit hole.
Zones and bookings related to zones and
Yeah.
specific routes in the jungle.
So hopefully, some people from outside the country are also listening to this. So they are probably familiar with the fact that when you get access to a wilderness area, you have access to the wilderness area. For
Yes,
example, if you get into Yellowstone, you can go into any part of Yellowstone. If you go into Kruger, you can go into any part of the Kruger. And the Kruger is a big park. It's bigger
Yeah.
than Belgium. It's as big as Israel. So it's a big park, but you can get in and get out anywhere, right? Now, here's the interesting thing with Indian parks is that our parks are zoned out. And by the way, there are some ways to cost control your experience, wherein certain zones are marked as premium zones, certain zones are marked as non-premium zones, and then there are buffer zones as well. And of course, each of these costs a different amount, so you can flex your cost a little bit. But the thing is, you decide to go to a park after having done some research, especially if you're a photographer, right? So you want maybe to see tigers with cubs. Now, what if you book a zone and the tigers with cubs are not in that zone? And I've had this situation where, in Bandhavgarh, there are two zones which are right next to one another. There's Ala zone and Magdi zone.
Yeah.
And geographically, they are contiguous. So there is a dam, and on the other side of the dam, there are tigers. On this side of the dam is us. But we can't cross the dam because, well, it's not in our zone. And look, you're paying a pretty penny to go see this magnificent animal. But you create these artificial distinctions that make it difficult for people to go get the sighting that they're after. And remember, there's nothing wrong in wanting to see a tiger in a tiger reserve. It's called a tiger reserve for that very reason. You're charging an extra amount for that very reason. So we shouldn't be vilifying people who want to see a tiger. You should instead be making it easier to see a tiger. But the other thing is that you could plan really well. So, for example, let's say I know of a tigress that has mated now and is likely to have cubs. Our parks close during the monsoons, so we get no news. But you have to book before the monsoons because you've got to book 4 months in advance. What if she gave birth to cubs during the rains and the cubs got killed? Hard luck. You're now stuck in a zone where probably you're going to have very limited activity. So, this kind of gamble that we have to take with our travel, and very inflexible kind of gamble, uh, makes it very difficult to travel. And a lot of people, again, this privileges people who are already privileged. So, what have I seen? I've seen people double booking themselves into 2 zones, 3 zones, saying, "Oh, if I don't hear of news in one zone, I'll just go to the other zone." Right?
Yeah.
Only a few people can do that in expensive trips.
Oh, and that comes at the cost of somebody else being able to go into that zone because permits are given,
Exactly.
right? So, and the other thing is that while the while there are stringent rules around booking, which zone can you enter, what are the timings, can you flexibly move across zones even if it is only half a kilometer into other zone, and so on and so forth, all of which being extremely inflexible, there are enough and more instances that we come across where not all of these rules are applicable to everyone. We've seen as many people sort of just go in and out of zones as they want to, not necessarily because there is a way to permit and there's a way for them to legally do it. They seem to do that because they seem to know someone somewhere, right? That sort of brings me to the next point that I want to talk about, which is about, a service mindset versus a gatekeeping mindset, because we seem to operate with a very, very strong gatekeeping mindset, don't we? We believe that there are permissions that need to be followed on paper, but if you sort of know the right people, you might be allowed entry, and we've seen enough of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big difference between how we experience tourism in, let's say, Africa. We talk about Africa as if it's one thing, but let's just say Southern Africa, right? Versus how we experience tourism in India, right? In India, it almost feels like the authorities are doing us a favor by letting us in. And then
Yeah.
for everything else, you have to ask for more favors. So let's take a few examples. I want a guide. Remember, the guide, you pay for the guide because they bring some expertise, right? And
Yes.
then if you have the same guide across your entire trip, then that really does add to your experience because the guide knows what you saw on day one, what you saw on day two, what you saw on day three, and they're trying to make your experience cohesive across the 1 week trip or 4 or 5 day trip or whatever. So having the same guide is a good thing. But if you want the same guide for all your drives, put in a request. Somebody will grant you that favor. You go to a park that does not have zones but has routes, right? And you believe that you're more likely to see something that you wanted to see on a certain route. You can't do that by yourself. There are no zones, but you now have to go and ask for a favor. Can I go down this route? And it's discretionary, right? There are no laid down rules as to when
Exactly.
this favor will be granted and when this favor will not be granted. So they feel like it, they grant it on that day. They don't feel like it, they don't grant it on that day. Similarly, think about stay inside the forest. There are some stays that are bookable by the public, but they're very hard to book. And there are other stays which the authorities hold at their discretion.
Yeah.
And who gets that? We know who gets that. I mean, people who know people in places, right? So that's the kind of problem. Whereas, again, if you look at Southern Africa, for example, you look at the Kruger. I don't need to know anyone to book a campsite in Kruger. I just go
Yes.
online, book it, right? I don't need to ask anyone whether I want to go down the gravel road or whether I want to go down the tar road. Up to me. I choose my own adventure, right?
Sure.
I don't have to do any of these things. I'm not asking anyone for favors. They're very clearly documented rules. You follow them, and that's it.
I think you used a very apt word for this in your blog, where you called it feudal, right? And it's pretty much what it is. And I was thinking a little bit about sort of where this comes from, right? Why is it that in certain countries we see forest or wilderness as an area where the community has access by default while the rules are maintained and rules are put in place by a certain department? Whereas, why in certain other countries, like India, for example, the forest is something that is by default access restricted, and the community need to ask the community needs to ask permissions to an authority to be able to access the forest, right? And and I think it probably goes back all the way to the colonial era. The first forest act in India came in the 1860s and then amended in 1878 and then in 1930. But back then, the forest was seen as a way in which revenue was collected in the form of timber and everything else that the British government needed. Up until then, even in India, forest was very much community land, used for grazing, used for pastures. Sure, the royalty used it for hunting, so on and so forth. But the Forest Acts sort of made it from being community land to government land. And post independence, we've had a forest department. But even back then, in the 60s, 1860s, and the 1930s, it was called the IFS, the Indian Forest Service. Post independence, also, it's the same apparatus that's been borrowed with the same mindset. And even though we've had a Wildlife Protection Act in sort of 1972, what that changes is that it sort of changed the focus of the forest department from revenue to conservation. I think tourism came in sort of much later. And one example I've heard a lot about in this context is when Colonel John Wakefield, who's the British expat in India, went to Nepal, saw how tourism was done in Nepal, which is based on the Africa safari model, brought it down to Kabini in partnership with the state government of Karnataka, called it the Kabini River Lodge then, which later in the mid 80s, I think, became jungle lodges and resorts that we sort of all know about. And that's kind of how tourism in wildlife areas in India started. So you see, there is a very big bureaucratic overlay which sort of comes over any tourism that needs to happen in India for this reason, and that's probably where this whole, you know, where this whole perspective of a wilderness area being gate controlled and entry restricted and permits being required to go sort of comes from. And there are very good reasons probably to do that, right? Of course, there is poaching. Of course, there's overcrowding. Of course, there is, people maybe taking over parts of forest land and so on and so forth. But my kind of issue with this is the is the default view, which is that a wilderness belongs to a certain department and not the community. And I think everything else sort of is a subset of that. And not that it's justification. We still need better service. We still will ask for better wildlife experiences and wildlife tourists when we go there. But that's sort of the reason why we have this kind of view in India versus Southern Africa.
Yeah, and it's also important to dwell on that point which you mentioned, right? The wilderness still belongs to the citizens,
Yes.
right? And the mindset should be that the citizens have the right to access the wilderness, and whoever is facilitating that right is then, by association, providing you a service. Now, I understand why this mindset hasn't prevailed because, again, the histories of these countries are very different in the sense that Africa was more about settler colonialism, India was more about extractive colonialism. So, in Africa, at least for the colonialists, safari was a way of life,
Yeah.
right? So, it's very firmly embedded into the culture, and hence the infrastructure has developed to support that way of life. And it's not just and a visiting tourist's way of life, it's the way of life for people who have settled there, hence the term
Yeah.
settler colonialists. Whereas in India, it was the visitor's way of life, wherein somebody would come, go on a hunt, and when the colonialists left the country, there wasn't a native population to carry on that culture, and hence there was no need to serve them. But now, if you look at it from the last couple of decades onwards, right, that culture has set in. Probably mid 1990s to now would be the period that you're talking about. So
Yeah.
about 3 decades of a healthy tourism infrastructure, or at least the potential for a healthy tourism infrastructure. And now
Yeah.
the mindset probably needs to change to say these are citizens. They should, by default, have access to their own forests. How can the authorities who administer this access act in a more facilitative, more service oriented way, rather than the old way where they took that gatekeeping attitude? And look, one of the
And
things, we don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but tourism, at least we are talking about it as an ally to conservation, right? As not necessarily being at odds with conservation. So, how do you then start
yes.
to make that tourism more educative, more immersive, more holistic?
And I think what's also contributing towards this being better in Africa is that as soon as the safari apparatus moved into a tourism apparatus, wildlife tourism and tourism per se, and wildlife tourism being a big part of the contribution to tourism revenues in Africa, was a significant chunk of their national revenues and GDPs. I think in India, tourism is not such a huge contributor, and wildlife tourism is a smaller chunk of that, right? Which also sort of makes it not super high on the list of people who want to improve this. And we're still in an era where the word profits, like sort of mentioned, in the wildlife context is seen as a bad thing. And we probably should do a separate episode on photography being an ally to tourism being an ally to conservation, and so on and so forth. But yeah,
Yeah. It's a bit chicken and egg, right?
yeah,
Which is to say, it's not big as an industry because we're not promoting it, facilitating it as we should. We could argue it that way. Or you could argue it this way, that it is not big and hence we don't need to facilitate it. So
yeah.
choose which side of the argument you'd like to be on.
What about wildlife experiences and wildlife travel in India that are not safari related? Like, sure, we go into protected area that is sort of has restrictions on entry timing, exit timings, and so on and so forth. But that's not all wildlife, right? We also have a bunch of other wildlife experiences here as well as abroad. How do you think they compare,
Yeah.
India versus abroad?
So we're talking about non-game drive kind of experiences, right? So even in the big game parks like Kruger, you can go on a bushwalk. For example, in places like Manapools, you can go with an armed ranger and approach wildlife on foot. So you don't have to always be inside a vehicle. And that's a very intimate way of experiencing wildlife. For example, in big game parks, you actually don't see a lot of big game on foot. At least in places like Kruger, you'll see elephants and giraffe, which are visible from a distance, but slightly more elusive wildlife. You're less likely to find them on foot. But you do get to experience other things, like you might collect a fossil on the way, or you might
Yeah,
see a herb that you wouldn't have noticed on a game drive. And that obviously enriches your experience. But then again, if you move out of some of these game drive parks and you go trekking for apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, excellent photography opportunities. But the most important part there is how well they are organized, right?
yeah,
All you do is buy your tickets, show up, and from that point on, they'll take care of everything, right? That's it. Nothing to do there. It is a bit like our controlled game drive experience in India, but it's incredibly well organized. Then think about, just those little side experiences that you and I had when we went to Botswana, where we took a flight over the Okavango, right? There is the opportunity for private players to come in and run these value added services.
yeah,
Similarly, the sleep out on the Makadi Khadi pans, right? It's another way of immersing yourself into a very, very surreal kind of habitat. And then before we slept out on the pans, we had a great time with meerkats, right?
yeah,
Right there where we slept out, we had a fire, a barbecue, good food. Why does food need to be austere? Why can't food be good? Like, why can't we actually have a good time and not be guilty about it, right? These are little things that just give you such an enriching experience when you're out there. And if I'm here, I'm always feeling like, oh, did I do something wrong? Am I on the wrong side of morality somehow?
yeah. And just to call out, it's not like we set a campfire next to where the meat carts were. We drove a fair distance into a designated camp area in the pans, and we had one of the most stellar evening experiences there because it was just out in the open, pans for as far as your eyes can see. There were about 10 or 12 guests, and just two people from the lodge were taking care of all of us, and we had a fantastic time, right?
Do we have something similar in India? Absolutely, we do. LRK and GRK are exactly that. They are large salt pans. Can we actually have an experience like this in LRK and GRK? Absolutely, we can. It's just a matter of being able to facilitate that and making it easy for people to do it.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I was coming to, right? You use a very interesting word there, which is the way it was organized. And I think we sort of miss that, not because there aren't enough, and this is my guess, not because there aren't enough private tour operators who can't provide that. I think we have the best resorts in India who could provide that, but I think that is just not there at the moment because there is a gatekeeper from getting to that place who by themselves aren't providing the best service and also are not sort of trusting the provider. And I have to call out how good the experience with meerkats were, not just for photographers, but because even anyone who wanted to see meerkats could do it from such close quarters, right? And I think there are some of these experiences in India as well, except all of these experiences are sort of before an authority figure gets involved. I can
Mhm.
think of a number of places in India that are just outstanding for photography right now. Sure, you don't have megafauna there. I'm not talking about tigers and elephants. I'm talking more about maybe seeing some interesting birds, maybe seeing some interesting reptiles, and all of these places are really good for you to go. And what happens over time is that as they start getting more and more popular, you have an authority come in and put gates at the entry of that, collect a fee, and provide no service in return to something that was free for everyone to access, and then make rules around when somebody can go there, somebody can't go there, ostensibly in order to quote unquote conserve it better. But
Yeah.
here is the slight irony in it, which is that the place became well known and well publicized because people were doing what they were doing, which is going there whenever they wanted to, taking photographs, operating with a certain degree of freedom. The authority figure woke up to it being around and then put a gate saying that we are now going to quote unquote conserve this. You guys stay outside and we will let you do this, and start charging a fee. And here's what I don't get, right? Every place that I pay a fee for, I want to know what I'm getting in return for it. For example, there's a lot of places that charge a camera fee. Like, what additional service am I getting as a photographer for paying that camera fee, however big or however small that may be, right? Because I can think of a jungle in southern India, which one fine day started collecting camera fees based on the length of the focal length of your lens, right? Simple as that. A 500 lens pays so much, a 200 lens pays so much, and multiple lenses, incur multiple fees. And if you're carrying two lenses, you pay up to the tune of sort of 2,250 rupees for every single time you make an entry into the jungle. And that's twice a day. That's about 4,500 rupees a day. It's close to $50, right? $50 just as camera fees per day. And it's not like because we were paying that, we got better seats that we could photograph from, or we got a better vehicle that we could photograph from. We were going in the same vehicle that you were going in yesterday, and you
Yeah.
were doing the same things that you were doing yesterday. But today there's a fees because you're going to the jungle and you can afford the fees. And sort of thinking is as simple as, if you can afford an expensive lens, you can afford a fee with nothing sort of being given a return, which is the kind of gatekeeping mentality I come to. So most good places in India have opportunities for photography if you're not too big on megafauna, birds, amphibians, reptiles, uh, even plants and sort of mushrooms and all of that. Until an authority figure gets involved, and that corroborates with the kind of, I mean, I'm making a bit of a leap here to equate an experience with photography and the photography results, but that corroborates with what we see in photography contests every year, right? The images that we see winning from India are seldom from tiger parks. On the contrary, the tiger images that we see are seldom from India. They are either from Bhutan or Russia, where, sure, they're rare, but they're camera trapped. And in India, you see images of bats, you see images of macro and insects, where people have the freedom to go and enjoy it. And yes, I am making a leap in terms of places producing better images necessarily having better wildlife experiences, but I think that is a leap I think I can make, having sort of been to these places. So yeah, uh,
Yeah.
I'll sort of end with the bottom line on a bunch of photography opportunities in India, a bunch of wildlife opportunities in India, which are great until an authority figure sort of gets involved.
Yeah. And just to make a fine point on your, take about contests, there are tiger images from India that win, but often those tiger images are created on the back of access, specialized access, right? So, for example, the access to set up a camera trap. And you need to know people to be able to do that kind of thing. Again, we have friends who do this, but you as an intrepid photographer can't just rock up to somebody and say, hey, can I get access to set up a camera? They're just going to ask you to take a hike, right?
Yeah.
So you really need to have friends in high places to be able to get that level of access. And then, sure, a tiger photograph from India can probably win you an award. The other thing is also just the thing to consider is that you build up a network, right, of people that you know. So, for example, back in the day, I got to know about a short-toed snake eagle's nest, right? Somewhere very close to farmland. You know, there are dogs there, there's cattle there are villages there, but the short-toed snake eagle had its nest, and every now and then it would bring something for the chicks in the nest. So I went there quietly and parked myself and was observing the nest. And remember, this is thoroughfare for most people, okay? I'm standing there quietly, engine turned off, just observing. And lo and behold, There is a bunch of authority figures there who've come to ask me, what am I doing there? By the way, there is no permit fee that I need to pay. There is no gate that I need to go through. It's just on the side of the road. But now they feel obliged to come and ask me, what am I doing there? They feel like they're empowered to actually check my vehicle with no warrant whatsoever. And when I say that it's an invasion of my privacy for them to check my vehicle, they decide that they have the authority to take me to their office and subject me to an inquisition. And it was a harrowing experience because all I was doing
Yes.
was parked on the side of the road, watching a bird, which probably every villager was watching.
Yeah.
But just because I was in a car and I had a camera on me, I became subject to harassment, right? So this is the gatekeeping mindset. On the other hand, you look at parks in Southern Africa, right? Nobody stops you from using your phone to communicate with another vehicle to find out where a sighting is. In fact, yeah, if you can contact friends, know from fellow campers where a sighting is, go there, no problem. There's a latest sightings app in central and southern Kruger, which you can use to get the exact GPS coordinates of a sighting, right? There are sighting boards that tell you where you can go and see something, right? If you can go in a convoy of 3 or 4 vehicles and you have radio, no problem, no rules to stop you from that. In Indian parks, you can't even carry a cell phone in some places. How do you coordinate? And why is it wrong
Yeah.
to coordinate? It's wrong to it's wrong to crowd an animal and to block its way and to harass it. That is fine. But why is it wrong to coordinate for a sighting?
I mean, totally with you on that, right? And we've seen this multiple times, like people driving around in Madagascar, and crowded as the roads were, every time we saw something interesting by the side of a road, because Madagascar is one of those countries where you find an immense amount of wildlife as you're sort of driving around, especially in the form of chameleons and birds. We could stop and we could photograph, right? So there are some community areas in India where wildlife is abundant, and we all sort of like to go and photograph them. And it's all great to do until an authority figure sort of gets involved. Which is why one of the favorite places I have in India is Gaushala in Rajasthan in the Churu district, where I just go. It's a community grazing area. There is a really small fee that you pay to the community that maintains the Gaushala. Like it wasn't there. Again, it's one of those things that's come about now. Back in the day, there was no fee or whatever, but now they realize that a lot of people are coming here. They're charging a fee. You pay them a small fee, and I photograph spiny tailed lizards and raptors to make arts content. And again, there are well marked paths there. I use them, and yeah, hoping that it doesn't sort of become a quote unquote a reserve or a protected area, so that we still have some of this. So, given all this, right, and given the high costs on one side and the limited services that we are getting on one side, how should wildlife photographers sort of think about wildlife photography in India overall? What do you think? What do you think we could make this experience better for ourselves?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you want to see a tiger, you want to see a lion in India, your options are limited. You'll have to go with the rules. I don't believe that
Yes.
this podcast episode is going to trigger a change in the rules. So get with the program and do what it takes, right? The bottom line still holds that the value for money that you will get in terms of experience, enjoyment, time in the wilderness, all of that, big game park to big game park, you will probably get more value, more enjoyment in a big game park in Africa than their equivalents in India, right? Uh, so that's just the bottom line. But then, you've talked about experiences which are not big game.
Yeah.
And I think that's where some of the, really unique experiences might still lie in India, unhindered, unencumbered by rules and gatekeeping and all of that. And I think it's
Yeah.
worth keeping our eyes out for that. By the way, all this said, I'm still going to visit, I think, three tiger parks in the next 6 to 7 months.
Yeah.
So, but that's because I want to see a tiger. I'm shallow that way. So why not?
No, I think, yeah, look, if you want to see a tiger, there's only a certain number of places India can do it in. Uh, and it's expensive, but yes, we've already acknowledged our privilege of being able to do it. As unhappy as we are for the services we get for the kind of cost we pay, you have to go to certain places in South India, maybe Central India, maybe Corbett, etc. And you sort of, like you said, get with the program. But I really double down on the point of considering non-game drive experiences, right? Because yes, every now and then it's good to be in a game drive for megafauna, but over the years, I have come to really enjoy photographing small critters. I've really come to enjoy macro photography. I've really come to enjoy photographing reptiles and amphibians. And not all of them are in protected areas. You sort of find them closer home. You don't even have to travel so much. And that's a wildlife experience that I've sort of come to enjoy. The other thing I'd say is that if I look back at my own sort of photography journey, uh, I had this mindset of I'm going to do a lot of places in India before I think of my first place outside India. And I wish I hadn't done that now that I've sort of done this for as long as I have. I think everyone who's in wildlife, be it just a wildlife tourist or somebody who also carries a camera, start thinking about experiences outside India sooner in your journey than later. Don't have this mindset of I'm going to look at a certain number of tiger parks in India before you get to Africa or before you get to any of the other places. Uh, it's important to start exploring wildlife destinations outside if you can, especially if you're doing big game drive tours in India, because, like we pointed out, the cost of going abroad might just not be that much more higher than what you're sort of spending in India. And whenever you can, sort of for the pennies that you're paying, try to demand a little more accountability from the authorities, right? Yeah, so I think that brings us kind of to the end. And like we said, wildlife itself is priceless, but the way we experience it isn't neutral. It's impacted by the kind of service providers we work with, the kind of gatekeeping there is, the kind of rules there are, and so on and so forth. And this really isn't against an authority as much as it is about what we can do to make our experiences better, where we can go, where we can stay away from, what we can do more of. And if you've had experiences in India which are similar to what we faced, please let us know in the comments. If you disagree with any part of this and you think that we've really not seen the good wildlife experiences in India and we need to go to a certain place to experience that, let us know about that in the comments as well. And there are two sort of videos that I'd like you to sort of go back and watch if you haven't already. One is the earlier one, wherein we speak of what South Africa offers versus what East Africa offers. We go into details about sort of the facilities on offer, the services on offer there. And another video which I've done on camping, which is a really bare bones camping experience in Botswana. And you should probably watch that to get an idea of what camping outside entails and get an idea of what the costs involved there as well. So you can make your own choices on whether spending that money is worth it or not. Anything on your end from the closing on the closing front, Sumit?
No, I would say we keep doing these conversations every now and then. So make sure that if you haven't already subscribe and share it with your friends because there are conversations we have about wildlife travel, photography, lots of other topics. I'm pretty sure you will enjoy those conversations once you subscribe to it on a regular basis.